Flourishing in community, a big topic like most of the topics are that we work with. Today, we're working specifically with belonging and being at home. This is Dr. Yuria Celidwen. Her book, Flourishing Kin, Indigenous Wisdom for Collective Wellbeing, is the main book that we're going to work with. Today, I wanted to look at what is belonging. We all know it. We all feel it. We feel it when we feel at home and when we don't. I wanted to explore that a little bit. As always, we're working with somatic inquiry. So as you're listening and looking at the slides, the inquiry part is to really stay connected with your body, with this moment in time, and just really noticing what is it that's coming up and how are we working with that. The practices in this book break the pattern of understanding contemplation, or another word for that would be the somatic inquiry as well, as a first-person practice that is purely self-reflective, stationary, and static. So in the weeks coming up, we're going to go into what she called second-person contemplation. And how does that work in a different way than what we might be doing here? When we're doing these inquiry practices, self-reflective, first person, we're getting to know ourselves, we're getting to observe and witness what is it that's coming up for us as we stir the pot a little. We're working with these concepts and beliefs and emotions and experiences. So it's a lot about what our experience is and what our beliefs are, what are our associations, traumatic things that have happened that inform us. So this is part of it. And then the next part of it is we go into small groups and we share. And part of what we're doing in the small groups is we're listening to other people and really seeing in our own direct experience that we're not separate, that we have a lot of commonality and we have a lot of difference as well. So when she talks about the ethics of belonging, she's talking about this profound connection that we have with individuals, communities, and the natural world. So with humans and other beings. And that there's this interdependence of all life forms and the environment. And that as we cultivate these relationships within ourselves, within our communities, and with the earth, that's when we start to live a life that feels more like we belong. We honor our connections to all kin, as she says, human and more than human, and to our living planet. When I was first thinking about fostering a sense of community and flourishing in community, Earth Mother isn't necessarily where I first go with that. And that's part of the reason why I'm really working with bringing in this Indigenous worldview of this relationship with each other isn't just looking to Earth for trying to do the best for Earth and try not to pollute Earth and all that stuff, but actually to move more into this living relationship with Earth. That's part of how we're going to be working with this topic of community, recognizing that it's more than just the people that we're around. One of the things she talks about in her book is how finding home has been a challenge for her, and therefore a constant source of inquiry. As an Indigenous person, she lives in Mexico. She has her community, but she also has a lot of experience with the Spanish culture and colonization from Spanish people. And the messages that she's received through that, what are some of the threads that go into this? So let's sit back here and look at some of these sentences. Let's start with, what is your personal sense of community? When you think of community, what comes to mind? And our in-person communities, our friends that we see, our family, our colleagues that we see in person, the virtual ones that we meet, we can know very intimately over Zoom or other platforms. Community, like-minded people. Sometimes I think about subcultures where we might feel very comfortable with a group of like-minded people. What is your personal sense of that? And then very related to that, where do you belong? When we think about belonging, I think about our physical space, social spaces, relational. There might be other things too there. What are the spaces that hold you? Let's settle into that for a moment. And it might be the physical space that you're in right now and the virtual space that you're in right now. Let yourself come up with some examples. What are some of the spaces that hold you where you feel safer and more comfortable? And notice what it feels like in your body as you bring those to mind. Where do you belong? Where do you not belong? What places scare you? When we think about relational, it might be being around a bully, being around someone who's really out of control in a big fight response, for instance. And we can have that in our personal lives as well as socially, communally. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just more as a counterbalance. We're just looking at the places that hold us, spaces that hold us. Walking down a dark city street at night would be one of the places that scare me. So not to go too far into that, but just to notice space is really important. If we're in a space where we can hear noises that we're not familiar with, or if you're living in a place where there's a lot of violence, there's going to be a different experience. Some people feel very at home in a city. Some people feel very at home in isolation and wilderness. So it's not a right wrong. And this related question as we're working with this, where do you feel at home? And what are some of the threads that kind of contribute to that? If you're really good at your job and you feel really at home at work, that might be one place. And so, why is it? Well, I feel like I'm part of something there. I'm in alignment with my values, or I like my coworkers. We support each other. I'm excited to be at work. That's one example. But where do you feel at home and why? And then why not? And again, let yourself feel that. What does it feel like when you bring that to mind? An example, well, I feel at home in my home. And why is that? So some of this is real basic nervous system stuff. I feel at home because I feel safe there. I don't feel at home because I don't feel safe there, physically, socially. This personal sense of community. What are some of the elements of where you feel safe, where you don't, where you feel included, where you belong, where you can relax? Continue to notice your somatic experience with this. What does it feel like in your body, your breath? And this last quote here, refreshing our sense of belonging in the world, that we widen the web of relationships that nourish and protect us, by Joanna Macy. She's a very well-known environmental activist. So how can we use this sense of belonging? So when we're looking at what holds us, what scares us, where do we feel at home, why or why not, that's something that we can work with and bring up to date with a bit more accuracy. So if we're looking at, well, I don't feel at home in a place where people are yelling, and that's because we've had a lot of harm in our younger life around people who are yelling, then we could use that as an information. Is there actually danger here? Maybe they're yelling because they're excited because their football team is winning. So this is part of the reason why we do these inquiries, is that we can see, what am I really reacting to here? And is it accurate? Partly what we're going to work with over this next several weeks is our sense of internal belonging. And we're much less vulnerable to other people when we feel a solid sense of belonging in ourselves. What are the nuances of this? How do I belong? Where do I belong? What spaces? Let's give that another moment. And then let's look at with whom. Specifically, people. We have our ancestors, and then we're in the middle, and then we have descendants. We have biological ancestors. If you think back to your family tree over the last 7 generations, for me, 7 generations ago, one set of ancestors came from Scotland during the Highland clearances and arrived in Nova Scotia. That was 7 generations ago. So that's something that you might know a lot about, you might not know much about. And then when you think about descendants, when I think about the amount of experiences and what's happened in that 7 generations to now, what's going to happen in the next 7 generations? So I know 2 generations, my child and their children. This is another way to connect. Then we also have our ancestors on the land I'm on now. So when you think about who was on the land that you're on now, 7 generations ago, for someone that's my age, that was around the time of colonization in North America, mid 1700s. There's people here from Europe, the UK, and all over different parts of the world. And there are Indigenous people who 7 generations ago, their experience was that colonization was starting to happen. But what is your experience with the ancestors on the land that you're on now? Do you know who they are? So that's something that we can have a variety of experience with looking at. And if you're a white person who's a settler on North America, Turtle Island, then there's a lot of complicated feelings about that. You might be a Black person whose ancestors came over with slavery. You might be an Indigenous person. You might be someone from Europe who came over 30 years ago or from somewhere else. So we have a lot of different experiences with this. We're not going to go into too much of that right now. I just wanted to point that out because I've had that question in my mind for a few years of the ancestors who lived on this land before I lived on it. And then people in the community where I live now, so my neighborhood, the surrounding areas, places where I can drive to or places where I walk. Who are those people for you? And that's again complicated by safety, feeling safe, not feeling safe. So that's not an easy thing either. There's always a lot of complexity when we're talking about relationships. And then we can move to the people who inspire me. So ancestors and descendants, and not necessarily biological. So when we think back to our own biological ancestors or our descendants, That's one thing. It could be children, nieces, and nephews in the other direction as well. When I think about my ancestors, I don't really feel them as that supportive. I felt a lot of disconnection. And that might be your experience as well, or maybe not. There's a few ancestors that I feel very close to and felt very supported and seen by. So let that come to mind. And then maybe not biological. One of the ancestors that I've been connected with for about 40 years is Audre Lorde. No biological connection there, and yet I feel very much like they're an ancestor of mine. I've learned so much from her and the way that she thinks and things she said. So, who are those for you? It might be people you know in person, it might be somebody that you know of. And who are the people who are younger than you who inspire you? And maybe that's someone that you've mentored. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's someone that you don't know in person, but that you really admire their courage, their kindness. Where are you in this web of life of ancestors, descendants, people who came before us, people who are here now, and people to come? So today we're really kind of getting an overall sense. What comes to mind when I think about community? Where do I feel like I belong? Where do I feel at home and with whom? What is my lineage? And as you're working with this, notice if you're shaming yourself at all, if you're feeling uncomfortable with anything. These are very complex inquiries when we look into our sense of community. And over the next weeks, we're going to work with our sense of belonging in the environment, with other people with whom we have a lot in common, with whom we don't. So, as we're working with this whole concept of community, one of the things that happens a lot is that we just kind of disconnect from people who we don't feel have a relationship with us. And we see that a lot with people who are kind of in a big fight response, people who are really politically divided. People get put on the other side. And if we're looking at something like the ancestors on the land that I'm on now, I'm in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And how am I feeling about that? We live in this situation now where we buy land, and the people who own the land get to live there and be on that land and pretty much do what we want with it. Each one of these elements has a lot of complication. I'm not bringing this forward in a sense of feeling guilt or shame or something like that, more just in an awareness of what are my connections. So there were people who were on this land that I'm on right now before me, and there's the land itself. A few months ago, we were working with Sherry Mitchell around sacred instructions. And one of the things she said in a talk I was listening to from her is there was a land back where her Indigenous tribe received title to 200 acres or some big piece of land. And she said when they first went back onto the land and did ceremony on the land, she said the land heard that language for the first time in 200 years. That language had been heard on that land for thousands of years. And now the people who spoke that language were back. I was so touched by that because it really brings to life the land itself. So when we think about connection, And when we feel into where am I connected? How am I connected? How am I disconnected? In the culture that we live in North America, the predominant white culture, land is not considered to be a living entity. We might be trying to protect it. We might be really concerned environmentally. And so in that sense, we're connected with it. But I'd like to really open up our feeling of who and what and where and how. How are we disconnected and how can we come back into connection? What is it that will help us to feel more at home?